Okay, now welcome to the next part of Chapter Three's video lecture series. We're going to start talking about one of the central tasks, one of the primary uses, rather, of VMware Workstation, which is to create virtual machines. Um, this is, before you can clone, before you can turn something into a template, before you can do any of that stuff, you got to have something to work with. And unless you're going to get all of your VMs from somebody who's already done it, you're going to need to be able to create these for yourselves. Now, before you create a virtual machine, you need to do some planning. Think about the type of OS that virtual machine is going to run, uh, the name of those files, where it's going to run, how much memory it needs to have, what kind of network connectivity it needs to have, what kind of virtual disk adapter, whether SCSI or SATA or IDE or SAS, whether it's going to be a fixed or dynamic disk, what its maximum disk size is going to be. Now, when we talk about disk type, what fixed versus dynamic, it's important to note here that VMware uses, particularly in its vSphere and vCenter category, uses slightly different terminology. In VMware terms, this is provisioning. Thick versus thin. Thin provisioned disk is obviously a virtual disk file, which is no larger than it needs to be. A thick provisioned virtual disk is as large as it can possibly be right from the beginning. And then within that category, there are two subcategories, which we will touch on again later, but I want to put it out there now. Lazy zeroed versus eager zeroed. The difference here is how much work, from one point of view, how much disk space is the virtual hard drive taking up. With a thick provision disk, it's taking up all of its space now. With a thin provision disk, it takes only what it needs to. That's a better option, particularly in workstation virtualization, when you don't want to, say, create a 100 gig drive and then carve off 100 gigs of your 500 gig internal hard drive. I mean, even if it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 terabytes, that's still a lot of space to give up. So you might want to go for the dynamic or thin provision route. On the other hand, if for a server, if you know you need to earmark that space so you can't possibly overbook yourself on the hard drive space, what you might want to do is do a thick provisioning. And there are two options there as well. Eager zeroed, what it literally does as it initializes all of the hard drive sectors, the hard drive blocks, hard drive sectors, it will actually write zeros to all of them right off the bat. With a thick provisioned lazy zeroed, it will earmark the entire size of hard drive that you need. It'll basically create a file of that size, but it won't actually initialize the new spaces of memory, the new storage space with zeros until it actually needs them. That's the difference between eager zeroed and lazy zeroed. There's a performance trade-off here. With a thick provision eager zero, it's going to take a lot longer to create initially, but it'll be faster in use. Whereas with lazy zeroing, it's the reverse. It will be slower in use, but quicker to spin up. As far as creating these VMs, you have two basic options: custom and typical. Custom is best because it gives you control of all your VM settings. Now, there's something to note in the book that may, between custom and typical, which might conflict with your experience of having used VMware Workstation 14 or 15 or 15.5. I think some of the things that used to be in custom have now become part of the typical installation. The custom options, you select your hardware compatibility, you select your installation method, you give it a machine name, a storage location, the number of processors, the amount of memory. These are choices. Now, processors, we don't make that choice in typical, even in Workstation 15, but we can choose the amount of memory and the guest OS and all of it. We can choose the network type. We can choose I/O adapter types for our hard drives, and it looks like this. So um, this should be very familiar to you by now. Either you're going to literally install from a disk or you install from a file. Now, this middle option, install from disk file, and you choose the ISO. That would seem to be the right choice because 9 times out of 10 we're going to be using ISOs. But if you choose this option, it will start making choices for you long before you want them to. Say it might ask you right off the bat for your license key. Particularly if you're using, say, an educational version of Windows and you don't have a license key because you don't need a license key because it is an evaluation, a time-limited evaluation license. It's going to ask you for things that you can't provide, that you won't provide, and it'll never quite work. So unless you have a good reason to do otherwise, always go with the bottom option. Now, now, if you do go to the, it's going to ask you for things like your product key, or the type of version of Windows that you're installing, your full name, your password, all of these things that would normally be part of the Windows installation process when you boot from that Windows ISO image and let the Windows installer do its thing. VMware is asking you about all of these things by itself. This is what I mean by it's going to start, it's trying to help you. Then, of course, your network connection. It's going to ask you, is it bridged? Is it NATed? Is it host only? Do you not want a network? These are things that you can change in your settings after you've spun it up. There are some other custom options. You can select your virtual disk type. SATA, IDE. These days, SATA, what IDE really, sorry, SCSI versus IDE. Even sometimes when they say IDE, what they really mean is they're simulating SATA. One of the big differences here is that with some, and we're going to talk about virtual hard drives in just a minute, with some guest OSs, like say Linux, if you add new SCSI drives, it's not going to find them right away. You're going to have to power the VM down and power it up. You can add them while it's running, but it won't see them. If you add SATA drives while it's running, it may actually see them. You're going to enter the maximum disk size. You're going to enter the name of the disk file. Now, what you should probably do is let it, particularly if this is an extra disk, yeah, actually virtual disk file. If you want to change the name of the hard drive, the virtual disk file, you can do that. What I advise you to do, on the other hand, is to not do that. Make sure, going back to planning, that you know what you're going to do right off the bat. Have the name of the VM, have the name of the host name of the guest OS, and you can use one of those two things as the name of the file itself, because you really do, just to deconfuse to limit your own confusion as much as possible. Make sure that your VMX file and your VMDK and all of it have the same name, which correlates to the name of the VM, which correlates to the name of the host operating system. Then, of course, you can review your settings, and it'll look like this: IDE, SCSI, or SATA. Whether it's independent or not. If it's independent and it's non-persistent, that means that whenever you restore a snapshot or power it off, all those choices will go away. Then you can change your maximum disk size. If you do allocate space now, that's a thick provision, a fixed disk. It'll earmark the whole drive, the whole size of that drive immediately. Whether you store your disk as a single file or multiple, that will more or less depend on what you need to do. You probably don't need to change the way this works. Just if it's set up multiple, leave it that way. It'll be easier to move, but if with very large disk, it will impact your performance somewhat. But if you're simulating a desktop OS with maybe 60 or 70 or 80 gigs of memory, it's not really going to hurt all that much. The downside, however, to that with snapshots is those snapshots are going to proliferate like nobody's business. So use your best judgment. If you don't know what to do, follow the directions. As you get a better sense of how these things work, develop a preference and go that way. We also see that it has a recommendation. for a given type, because you tell it what kind of OS you want to load, and it starts deciding what you might want to use. You can always dial up from that. So the next thing we'll do is we're going to talk about the easy install process and some libraries, and then we're going to get into the manual toolbar. So thank you, and I'll be right back.